Great. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am glad that you could make it to this evening's program um, on New England Stone Walls. My name is Cindy Grove. I'm the director of the Rockport Public Library. And with me, I also have Tom Clark, who is the assistant director at the Rockport Public Library. And our speaker today, Jennifer Robinson. I want to, again, thank you all for coming. I also want to thank the Friends of the Rockport Public Library for sponsoring not only today's event, but a lot of our other programs that we have going on as well. So I encourage you to take a look at our library's calendar on our website to see what else is coming up, because there's lots of great programs. Lots of great things on Zoom, and we're also working on adding some in-person and hybrid programs as well. For tonight's program, again, we're learning about the history of stone walls in New England. Stone walls are an iconic landscape feature of New England. They once served a functional purpose, but today they are threads through time, defining the region's historical identity. Join Jennifer Robinson, our Preservation Services Manager at Historic New England, to explore the history of Stonewall building in the region, develop a framework for identifying different types of stone walls, and consider preservation issues related to stone wall maintenance and protection. Prior to joining Historic New England, Jennifer worked as a research fellow in historic landscapes at the Preservation Society of Newport County, a research consultant for the Adirondack Stonewall Initiative. I pronounce that somewhat okay. And
Yes.
what I mean. Thank you. And a museum curatorial assistant at Newport Historical Society. She earned a BS in textiles, fashion merchandising, and design from the University of Rhode Island, and an MSc in architectural conservation from the University of Edinburgh, Scotland. So quite the background. Thank you for being here, Jennifer, and for presenting to us tonight. So I will pass the screen on to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was a great introduction. And thank you everyone who is here tonight. I hope you'll at least learn a few new things about stone walls and maybe more. I have a lot of photos to show you and a lot of history, so I will get started. So as Cindy said, I work for Historic New England. And just to give you a little bit of background about who we are the region's largest and most comprehensive preservation organization. So we cover all the New England states. We have 38 house museums. We have an archive with over 1 million documents. We have a collection of New England objects in Haverhill. And we also do a lot of preservation programming and advocacy. So for those of you that live in Essex County, you might be familiar with us from Beauport in Gloucester. That's the house you see at the bottom left. We also have Cogswell's Grant, as well as Spencer Pierce Little Farm in Newbury, among many other properties. So we do have a bunch of properties in the North Shore, which are fantastic, and I would highly recommend visiting this summer. And so what I do with the preservation services team is kind of fourfold. I work with our preservation easement program, which protects over 120 privately owned houses that have deed restrictions. So I help to oversee that. We also provide technical advice to homeowners throughout the region who might have questions about how to preserve their houses. We also engage in a lot of advocacy and intervention strategically throughout the region. And of course, education is a big part of what we do. Similar to tonight, we try to get out there and share what we know with the public. So that's kind of who we are. And so to get to the nitty-gritty of what we'll be looking at tonight, I think it's easy to think of just a stone wall as a pile of rocks, but they're definitely more complicated than that. we're going to learn why they're so closely associated with New England specifically. We'll delve into some of the considerations when tackling stone wall repairs and preservation, and we're going to look at historic trends in stone wall building. We'll look at recent preservation efforts and also the protections, which tend to be limited from a legal perspective in protecting stone walls. So we're going to look at all of that, and I will get started as soon as I can. So first, we're going to take a look at the history of stone walls. And I chose this photo. This is from Block Island in Rhode Island. Rhode Island's my home state, so there are several Rhode Island photos. But I really liked it because I feel like it evoked the vastness of what we're going to be talking about, and sort of the types of open landscapes that stone walls inhabited. We know that when English colonists first arrived in New England, they brought with them agricultural practices that were radically different from those practiced by indigenous people who were already living on the land. And we see this evidence in the thousands of miles of stone walls that thread throughout New England. They border our roads. Sometimes they wend through the woods. There are so many different stone wall types, from single walls to tossed walls and double walls, which we'll all cover. And each is an enduring representation of where and why and when they were constructed. So you kind of have to think of it in that way. And of course, we see local distinctive variations based on different types of stone. Different builders use different techniques. And although some walls were built for public display, which we'll see in the 19th century, most were built as enclosures for livestock to keep them away from crops. So another one of my favorite historic images here from Martha's Vineyard. This is just a fantastic statistic. So in 1939, there was a mining engineer named Oliver Bowles who estimated that there were approximately 240,000 miles of stone walls in New England. He based this on an 1872 USDA report. And it's estimated that that distance is further than the distance to the moon or the length of the coastline in the US. So why exactly are stone walls so prolific in New England? So we're going to take a look at that first. So one of the first things you often hear is that it was the glaciers. So as you probably know, large glaciers covered New England. You see here in the image of the Laurentide ice sheet, which reached its sort of maximum area and covered New England between 115,000 to 25,000 years ago. But you'll notice it also covers the Midwest too. So why doesn't the Midwest have as many stone walls as New England, from the glacial erratics until that were left behind when the glacier retreated? The answer lies in New England's particular geology. The types of stone that we see in New England are harder. You see here in this image, the red denotes granite, certainly a very hard stone. In the Midwest, where the glacier was and retreated, their stone tends to be limestone, a lot softer. So as that glacier started to retreat and pull back on the bedrock, it more easily kind of crushed the limestone in the Midwest. There weren't as many large stones left behind in that glacial till, which is why we see so many left behind in New England, where there's a lot harder stone that was extant after the glacier retreated. And so we see here too, a lot of variation even in stone types regionally. The photo on the top I took in Westport, Massachusetts. I was saying earlier, I like to take photos wherever I go because I'm looking at different stone types to see what they can tell about the geology of the area where I'm working. So that was taken in Westport, very round, kind of pebbly stones. The middle photo is from Waltham, Massachusetts, a lot more angular, large boulder-like stones. And the bottom photo is from Middletown, Rhode Island, which has very thin, sort of slabby stone. So our unique geology gives us many different types of stone to work with. So the third reason that resulted in a high density of stone walls in New England was deforestation, which was the result of land clearance for agricultural purposes. So these images, which I think are fantastic, they're from Harvard's Forest Fisher Museum. We see how different the landscape would have looked between the mid 18th century and then the mid 19th century. Now the pendulum has swung backwards. When we go in the woods where it's been reforested, we still see the remnants of the stone walls that once populated the farmland. But with deforestation, it resulted in a lot of upheaval of the landscape, which I'll show you in the next slide. So in taking a look at changes in the soil layers before and after deforestation, you'll see that on the left in the diagram, the thickness of the topsoil is depicted before land clearance. Obviously, trees help the land to retain water and topsoil, and without them, the soil erodes and starts to wash away. So the erosion of the topsoil exposed New England's subsoil to the cold, which caused a deeper freeze of that underground groundwater and accelerated what's called a frost heave. So frost heave is an upward swelling of soil as the soil starts to freeze and thaw. So as that deeper groundwater froze, and that thaw cycle repeated each spring, it brought new stone to the surface. So before it was much lower, those freeze thaw cycles then began to bring the stone to the surface. So the most prolific period of building of stone walls appears to have occurred in the mid to late 1700s because of this phenomenon. And because it took that long to deforest the land and thereby start that frost heaving process. So that late 18th century period to the early 19th century seems to be where we get the most walls being built. Now, before we move forward in time and talk about colonial walls and structures, I think it's also important to think about the reason why walls were being constructed and by whom. And for most of the walls we'll be discussing are obviously related to colonial settlement and those agricultural patterns that were brought here. But I think it's also important to remember the indigenous people who inhabited the land and also often used stone in building, albeit for many different purposes. And for many people and tribes throughout New England, stone formations and other stone structures have spiritual significance that's tied to the land and tied to ancestral homelands. I've seen this from my own personal experience working in the field. I went to a site in Blackstone Valley that had an overlay of both Native American stones and stone formations of spiritual significance and overlay of colonial stone wall building. So I think it's just possible when you're looking at a landscape that there are these overlaps and then there's this indigenous knowledge of the landscape that has carried through generations. So it's important to just kind of keep in your mind as you're working or viewing a particular site. I've also included an image from the Narragansett tribe who has a long and robust history with stone wall building still to this day. And here they are constructing a wall in a project at Brown University. So like I mentioned, the height of stone wall building, mid to late 18th century. But the interesting thing is that some of our earliest enclosures were wood. We just can't see them anymore because they've disintegrated, they've decayed. before the mid to late 1700s, wood was plentiful. It was something that settlers were really excited about because they were coming from landscapes in Britain that had been deforested. It was the fastest way to build an enclosure. And this idea of enclosing the land is related to varying degrees of farming practice in Britain, which could vary regionally. But typically, when land was enclosed in England, it was done with hedgerows, or it was done, if you've ever visited the British Isles, it was done with hedgerows, or in more northerly regions in Britain, it was done with stone. So that stone wall tradition was already kind of in the back of the mind. Now, another interesting thing, as we're thinking about agriculture and how it's tied to stone walls, many tribes in the Northeast were engaged in agriculture while still maintaining their traditional hunting and fishing patterns, sort of a transient lifestyle. But many had seasonal villages and planting sites that they were planting multiple crops together on a site. When the settlers arrived, they saw this as disordered. Like, why are there different plants in the same field? We're used to a system where we plant individual types of plants in distinct borders. And in fact, the indigenous farming practices are really interesting. All those plants support each other. If you're familiar with a Three Sisters type garden, they sort of mutually benefit one another. But the settlers were used to a different type of agriculture, monocultural, and they saw any kind of work on the land, including clearing, organizing, fencing, which was the term for stone walls. They were called stone fences. That was seen as improving the land and sort of justified claiming it as property. So after the Revolutionary War, the colonists were confronted with severe timber shortages, and this is documented through a lot of primary resources. But after decades of clearing those forests for farmland, their once infinite supply of wood couldn't meet the demand of having to build homes and damage fences following the war. So they turned to stone, which was plentiful by that time, to start building. And you can see that here in the myriad of photographs we have from around New England. But how exactly were these walls built? And I've heard people ask this too, and I was curious. Sometimes you see stones that are so huge, it's amazing to think, how were these moved? Earlier, we talked about glacier deposits and the different sizes and types of stone that could have been worked by the glacier into till. And some stones were small enough that two people could lift them. However, if they were really big, what they would do would be to use what was called a stone boat or a skid to pull the rocks into place using oxen. Sometimes stones were just simply too big to move. There were other methods that helped to kind of break down the stone over several seasons, including drilling holes so that ice could form and start breaking the rock apart. And later on, the use of explosives like dynamite were used to get the stones out of the field. There were just so many that were inhibiting the growth of crops. I also included two tools at the bottom. You see what was called a flat wedge at the left and a plug with feathers at the right. The flat wedge dates to the 18th century. The plug and feathers dates to the 19th century. Both in concept are similar in that you're drilling into the rock a couple of inches and creating a split. So as walls became more complicated, people had more bandwidth to start building more complex walls. You'll see them trying to create more distinct shapes. And oftentimes I included in the photograph, you'll still be able to see these actual drill marks in the stone. These were done by hand. Now, during colonial America, It's also important to remember that the walls, like I said, were being built mainly because of the introduction of animal husbandry to the landscape. And with mixed fields side by side, you can't have animals roaming into your crops because they'll start eating them. And so you needed to have sort of a legal framework to protect your crops. And one of the more interesting 18th, 19th century jobs is that of the fence viewer, which we see in a lot of New England towns. I included here the title page of a record book from the 19th century that creates a record of, quote, stray beasts and lost goods commencing in 1875. So they're actually recording and making sure, the fence viewer was making sure that walls were stable and were kept in good condition. They may have also used the tool that you see at the bottom right, which is called a Gunter's chain. These were used by land surveyors, but also fence viewers. They have 100 links that measure 66 feet. So a lot of those like meets and bounds you see mentioned in record books, they're using this tool. It's a tool that was developed in Britain and it was brought to the British colonies. So you might be wondering, where did the animals go that escaped? And the answer is they went to the town pound. The town pound was typically found in the New England town or village and was made of stone. And many are still existing. I have a colleague who shared these photos with me. He enjoys when he's traveling through New England looking for town pounds. So it's kind of a fun thing to do. And yes, these town pounds were built with stone. You basically had to bail your animal out of the pound. You had to pay a fine in order to retrieve the animal back. So it was just kind of held there for safekeeping. Now, in this part of the presentation, the next following slides, I'm going to look at some historic New England related sites and use them as tools to show you how to read or maybe understand stone walls through primary sources, through viewing them, and how to just go about that as you approach stone walls in your own community. So this first slide deals with very early colonial settlement, so the 17th century. As I mentioned, Historic New England has 38 museum sites. I work out of Waltham at the Lyman Estate, and we recently worked with the Waltham Historical Society, and there was a historian there named Mort Isaacson who was researching the stone walls in Waltham and whether or not they lined up with boundaries on early Waltham maps. So you might remember that I mentioned the most prolific period for stone wall building was in the mid to late 18th century. However, there was some degree of stone wall building earlier than that, particularly in certain areas of New England. The closer you get to the coast, there was actually more surface stone. So there are earlier walls that were being built, including boundary walls. So the map you're seeing here dates from 1738. It shows the original colonial land grants from 1634 to 40. And then here's a look at Waltham today. So pretty much the same boundary, just a few tweaks to the border. And these were called the Great Dividend Grants. They consisted of 120 lots divided up among 120 so-called freemen. These were not the only male residents in Waltham, but they were generally the wealthier men and those who belonged to the accepted church. And the lots were divided into 4 groups of 30 lots, and these were called squadrons. And each group of lots had a specific measurement. You can see that in the narrow plotting of the lot lines there. So that shows the lines of the squadrons. So our line of stones that we were researching with the Waltham Historical Society, we found that it actually does line up with boundaries as shown on this early map of Waltham. So this is a good example of using a primary source document, matching it up with what's physically on the ground to determine if stone walls relate to boundary lines. It's also a good way to start to understand land use in the particular area where you live, because that could also vary from region to region. You know, the way Rhode Island was developed may have been different than certain areas in Massachusetts. Now, heading into the 18th century, this is one of historic New England sites in Rhode Island called Casey Farm. Beautiful coastal farm. It tells the story of a prosperous sort of middle-class farm site. And another way to look at walls is through the eyes of people that built them. And this can often be complicated. Finding specific archival references can be hard, but you're sometimes able to find these traces in diaries, ledgers, and other period documents. Among the Casey family papers, which we've had volunteers transcribe, are entries by Silas Casey, who you see at the top left, and his descendant, Thomas Lincoln Casey Sr. And their entries detail Stonewall building efforts on the site, which was a fantastic find. So it includes descriptions of the lengths of the walls, the types of the walls being built, and laborers who built the walls during different periods. We know that a hired African-American farmhand named Caesar Northrop built many of the walls. And we also found out that a tenant farmhand named Reynold Knowles built 900 feet of wall, 5 feet in height, in exchange for 600 pounds of Narragansett cheese, which he could have used to trade with other people. So just a fascinating glimpse into that whole side of the farm that we didn't know before. I think it's a reminder that stone walls are obviously the works of innumerable people that we may or may not ever know, depending on when and where. The walls could have been built by farmers, farmhands, and certainly enslaved individuals, both Black and Indigenous people, and later freed Black and Indigenous people, as well as indentured servants and the like. So if you're able to find a firsthand account, it's an extremely valuable tool in understanding the people who lived and worked in the landscape. And we see here an aerial view of Casey Farm that shows how a farmyard would have been developed, a middle-class farmyard in New England. Walls at the field's edges were typically tossed piles of stones, while the walls that were closer to the farmyard and the farmhouse tended to be more elaborate, maybe a double wall. And this image also shows how the typical field was divided. Very small fields in New England, only a couple of acres, that were bounded by walls. Now, maps of varying types are another great source of information. And in this 19th century map, you can see how much the landscape had changed since that early settlement period. This is in Middletown, Rhode Island, which is just north of Newport, if you're familiar. So this 1876 survey delineated or illustrated dotted lines, most likely indicate stone walls or field boundaries. And this shows how New England farmers had divided and fenced their land. And they were doing that under the assumption that small fields produced the best yield. And in reality, those small fields were usually what most families could manage on their own. However, by the time the Industrial Revolution starts to hit the US, there was a significant decline in farming in New England. By 1850, there were about 168,000 small family farms in New England and New York. About 75 to 80% of our region had been cleared and farmed. So that farming worked well for several generations in a subsistence sense. But in actuality, those small walled fields became an impediment because there were lots of new developments in agriculture. There were horse-powered machinery, and that needed more space. And eventually it was difficult for New England farms to compete with much larger industrial Western farms. And also the increasing demand for food in urban areas. And we see here the process of farmland being overtaken by trees again. Now, the Industrial Revolution also brought about a new type of stone wall building tradition. These walls were obviously not for agricultural purposes, but often as a statement of affluence. Estate walls often served an aesthetic function. They enhanced a home's beauty. And interestingly, they often employed skilled masons from Europe who had built those stone masonry skills through trade training there. And in contrast to agricultural walls built from found materials, these walls often were comprised of stone from non-local sources. And this change in materials it started to sever the historical relationship between wall building and farming and the local land. And the Industrial Revolution also increased demands for stonemasons to start constructing other things like railroads and bridges and factories and country estates like we see here. This is the Eustis Estate in Milton, Mass. It's one of our newer historic houses open to the public. And there was this movement of urban elites to build country estates, much in the same way as a British landed gentry. And this house's proximity to Boston meant that it provided access for its owners to be in the city, but also benefit from a sort of rural lifestyle. Let's see. So here we see the gatehouse and powerhouse at the Eustis Estate, which became the permanent residence of William Ellery Channing Eustis and Edith Hemingway Eustis in the 1870s. Their stone outbuildings, and this was actually a powerhouse to generate electricity. They displayed both quarried stone and fieldstone construction. And in fact, during his residency, Eustis actually created a sort of a gentleman's farm. He maintained a small farm with livestock, cultivated fields and hay fields, and ice pond, which sort of perpetuated the site's agricultural use. Milton had been nearly completely agricultural before this time. Now, at the turn of the 20th century, this is a time of great romanticization in America, but stone walls, I think, often came to be viewed in a romantic sense, capital R, romantic. There are vestiges of a simpler past, what was viewed as a simpler past, free of the ills of the Industrial Revolution and sort of icons of New England identity. And during this colonial revival period, that was certainly true. You can see a lot of revivalist restoration happening. And this is evident. This is the Dolittle House in Newbury. And you can see in the 19th century photograph, there's actually a wood fence. But by the 1950s, around the 1950s, later restoration campaign, somebody, we're not sure exactly who, decided to build a stone wall on the site, which is a really interesting, reviving something that wasn't there, but something that was obviously viewed as very iconically New England. And as the New England landscape continued to be reshaped by new generations, agricultural stone walls endured. And this is a really interesting example. Walter Gropius, the famous modern architect, Bauhaus founder, when he fled with his wife Isa Gropius in 1938, they fled Nazi Germany and ended up in Lincoln, Massachusetts. They chose this site on a hilltop delineated by stone walls to build this really experimental modern house. And Gropius really tried to integrate both the vernacular in New England with his design. And so he used retaining walls that were made up of agricultural stone that was still found on the site to create these boundaries in a nod to the house's or the site's history. And he designed the landscape immediately surrounding the house to seamlessly give way to the site's historical character. It's sort of a dialogue between the domestic use of the house and the house's agricultural past. So wrapping up this history section, we know that stone walls once served a functional purpose. Today, they're still there. They're threads through the landscape that define our region's historical identity. And they're imbued with a diverse history of our inhabitants. They're memorials to our region's agricultural past, and they've endured centuries of New England's harsh winters and weather, and certainly development pressure, and they've weathered abandonment. So their familiarity makes them both cherished and often overlooked, and their permanence is often taken for granted, which leads us to the second part of tonight's lecture, which is the theme of preservation and protection. We're going to take a look at some of the threats that stone walls face, and despite their significance and importance, they are consistently under threat, as we know from both natural and human forces. We know that roots from vegetation can push, and trees can push walls apart. Their proximity to driveways and roads makes them susceptible to damage from vehicular traffic or plows. And their seemingly public access leaves them open to theft, which is probably the one thing that drives me the most crazy. And their locations are often deemed inconvenient for development. So we see a lot of clashes sometimes between developers and the locations of stone wall boundaries. So there's state legislation that protects stone walls to varying degrees in 3 New England states. Unfortunately, the Massachusetts general laws that protect stone walls are quite weak. As you can see here, walls are, or if a wall is damaged or portions of the wall are removed, the fine is only $10 to the person that did this damage. So it's not really a robust law. In Rhode Island, a woman named Leona Kelly sponsored this act, which does provide some stricter protections. A convicted defendant will actually pay restitution at the discretion of a judge for damaging walls from the 17th century all the way up through the 20th century, even new stone walls that closely resemble historic walls. So definitely some more protection there. And then New Hampshire is the 3rd state where stone walls are protected by law. If they're part of a state scenic road. So if the state designates a scenic road that has stone walls, those stone walls are legally protected. Now, in a similar vein, in Massachusetts, it's important to look for local ordinances and protection depending on where you live. In Massachusetts, there is a Scenic Roads Act, for example. So local town governments can designate a scenic road. I noticed that Rockport may have tried to do this. I'm unclear whether it was successful or not, but basically a road is designated by the town as a scenic road, and the walls around it can't be removed or altered without consent of the local planning body. I also included this document that was created by the Department of Conservation and Recreation. It's a great resource if you're just looking to find out more about scenic roads and their significance to our landscape and environment. So aside from legislation or local ordinance, a lot of protection for stone walls comes down to local advocacy and building relationships with other stewards of historic sites and museums and other volunteer bodies. These are just a few of the efforts that I've come across in my work related to stone walls. I will say that the Dry Stone Conservancy in Kentucky and the Stone Trust in Vermont, which would be the one closest to us, are two of the best organizations for learning how to construct stone walls. And I'll be talking a little bit about that next. For documentation efforts, I will point you right away to the New Hampshire Stone Wall Mapper, which is the coolest thing. I'll show you a picture. They're using LiDAR technology, that's light detection and ranging. LiDAR takes scans, topographical scans of the landscape, and it can detect changes in topography even below the tree line. So it can actually pick up things like stone walls, cart paths, things that might not even be visible when you're walking on a landscape. So they've used their LiDAR images and asked volunteers to map whether or not that wall still exists or if there's a wall as indicated in the scan. And if you go to their state website, you can see all the work that's been done. It's really, really a great model. Now onto wall construction, which was one of the most fun workshops I've ever personally done. Before I joined Historic New England, as Cindy was saying earlier, I worked as a research consultant. I was gathering research on stone walls on Aquidneck Island, which is the island where Newport is in Rhode Island. And this was a collaboration between the Preservation Society of Newport County and Preserve Rhode Island, two nonprofits. And we were trying to build a framework for what is now a volunteer program to rebuild stone walls in the area. But in doing that, we realized we needed training ourselves to understand how stone walls are constructed. So this photo was taken at the Stonewall Trust in Vermont. In the barn is a facility where you actually can do a workshop to learn how to build a dry stone wall. And we use guidance from the Dry Stone Walling Association of Great Britain, who also has some fantastic publications, and their 5 principles are what I'm about to show you. So they have 5 principles that are important when considering building a stone wall or repairing a stone wall. So most stone walls that you're going to encounter will probably fit into one of these 3 categories. Stone piles are usually fairly loose. They were a quick way to just get stone out of the way at the edge of a field. Oftentimes, there may have been taller wood structures built on top of them to prevent animals from jumping over. Single stack walls are just as it seems, a wall built of a single row of stones, more carefully fit together, a little bit more careful in their construction. And the type of wall that we are going to look at in the next few slides is the double wall, which is arguably the most complex type of stone wall, but it's a great way to understand how dry stone walls actually work and stay together. So the best models still standing rely on the careful fitting of each stone and gravity to keep them together. And a lot of people are often surprised or unsure, how is this possible without mortar? And the reason is because the wall can naturally adapt and flex. The wall, if the stones are fitted together properly, it has the ability to be flexible when weather changes, freezing, cooling, soil changes. It's able to kind of work with the landscape. The 5 principles that are outlined here, as I said, are from the Dry Stone Walling Association. And our early wall builders would have had experience most likely with stone wall building. A lot of their work was also just trial and error based on the different types of stone that they were finding throughout the regions where they settled. So beginning in the 1800s, there are some agricultural publications that try to teach people how to build stone walls. There's no one good consensus. One of the things that they always recommend, however, is that stones should be stacked 1 over 2 or 2 over 1. So like this, okay? You wanna make sure that when you're stacking stones, you're laying them out almost like you would lay out bricks, which are more regular in shape. But what you want to avoid are these vertical joints. If you have vertical joints, that creates a structural instability in the wall. The second principle is setting the length of stone into the wall rather than horizontal. And you're looking at the wall here from up above. And you'll see examples out in the field that don't follow this principle or may not follow some of these principles, but these are best practices, tried and true, that hold the wall together. And you can see that here pointed out, the stones and what not to do. Now, the third step is to make sure that you're harding the wall tightly. And harding, you're looking at the wall in a sectional view here. Harding is the center of the wall. It's small stones that fill up most of the body of the wall, and again, give it stability. And we'll see a photograph of that in a minute. The fourth principle is to keep the stones level across courses. Just like brick masonry, you need to keep things level in order to provide stability. And finally, you need to think about also building in plane with the wall. So the vertical sides of the wall also can't be bulging. If that happens, it also will lose some of its structural integrity. Now let's take a closer look at the parts of the double wall and their construction. So the footings or the foundation stones are going to be the bottommost layer. They are the largest stones that you choose. And sometimes these stones are buried. That gives them a more stable base for the wall to rise from, particularly in freeze and thaw cycles. In this image, we also see the principle of keeping stones level. So the mason has used string called mason's line to level each course, both across the wall and vertically. So the wall's rising up like that. And you can see I've outlined here, although the photograph sort of distorts the line, they are in fact keeping those courses in shape. And as the mason continues to add more courses, they'll move these strings up the frame that you see. The frame that looks kind of like an easel is called a batter frame. And this keeps the angle of the wall accurate during the process of building. So the double stack or double wall gets its name from the 2 sides or faces of the wall, and the faces of the wall are built by adding courses of face stone, just like brick masonry. And so this is the same wall as the previous slide after a few more courses have been added. Starting at the bottom with the largest stones to the smallest at the top, the stones are stacked at a slight angle. That's the batter. And in this photo, we see the batter frame again, helping the mason to keep maintaining the appropriate angle that he's aiming for. And since we're working with a regularly shaped material, I think this is something that I didn't fully understand until I did it myself, but how much work goes into choosing the right stone for the right location. And you have to, sometimes it's trial and error, finding the right stone to kind of fit and click into place. The principle here, building the outer walls, is that each stone has 3 points of contact. And then often you have to use what are called pinning stones, which are smaller stones that you end up sort of sliding under or inserting under the larger stones to try to keep them from rocking. And once you feel like that outer stone is secure, you also add layers of harding stone, which is the stone I mentioned before. That just adds more heft and body to the center of the wall and kind of holds everything together. Now, if a wall gets to be 3 feet or higher, a through stone is used. And that's the stone you see Lee, who was my colleague, holding there. It's running horizontally across the wall, connecting both sides, both faces of the wall. And it provides, because of the height, it gives it a little bit of extra rigidity or stability. And so the last step in building the wall is adding capstones. These are unfortunately the ones that get stolen the most because people think they can use them for patios or other uses, but they actually protect the interior of the wall and all those harding stones. And they also create a nice finish. Occasionally, not often in New England, but occasionally you will see copestones like this, which are almost placed like books on a shelf. They are a really easy way to add additional height for a farmer to add additional height to a wall that they want to prevent animals from jumping over. I've heard anecdotally that some types of livestock, such as goats, don't like to jump over copestones because it's difficult for them to assess from the ground whether or not those top stones are stable. But the jury is out. I've seen goats do lots of crazy things. So I've heard that was used as a technique in agriculture to contain animals. So lastly, we're going to take a look at maintenance and repair, kind of the questions you ask as you approach a project. This is one of the stone walls, actually the first stone wall that was completed through a grant in the Aquidneck Stone Wall Initiative. And as you can see, this wall had the roadbed had been built up over time. It's a retaining wall. And I think the biggest takeaway from this project was that having a stonemason who is trained in dry stone walling, they're difficult to find, but when you find them, it's so important because they understand intuitively the correct way to do things. And in the next few slides, we'll look at some different wall types and how this kind of factors in your philosophy for repair. So there are 3 general kinds of walls that you might encounter. The first of those are wild walls. These are the ones that you might see in forested areas. They're overgrown. They're abandoned walls from farms. And there may be tumbled down and perhaps in the most difficult condition. The second type of wall you might encounter are historic walls. So these are with a specific cultural value. Maybe they're associated with a specific event or place. Maybe they bound a cemetery or a particular site. And third are estate walls, as we talked about, constructed primarily for decorative or ornamental reasons, often using non-native stone and sometimes many times using mortar. the earliest stone walls were probably a combination of stone and wood, like I said, but over time, as that stone or wood deteriorated, what we're left with are stone piles. Stone piles are the type of wall that I showed earlier that are just tossed stone away from the field. Then there's single stack and double walls, which we've just looked at. And occasionally you'll find different types of walls that vary regionally. In Martha's Vineyard, there are what are called lace walls, which are very specific to the island. The masons there used their particular type of stone and created walls that have these gaps and kind of creates this delicate appearance of lace. So considering how your wall is constructed should be informing kind of your preservation decisions. You also might encounter some different walls if you were to travel to different places with different stone wall building traditions. I'm showing these walls not because they're necessarily specific to New England. They are from, they're actually on display at the Stone Trust in Vermont. So if you're in Dummerston, Vermont or nearby, I would highly recommend it. It's almost like a museum of stone walls that they have. It's really amazing. I'm showing you these images just to show the complexity of stone wall building. Both of these walls have double wall as their base, but each of them sort of employs different means on the top courses. The Scottish Galloway wall has basically as a double wall and then a single wall on the top. The Irish family wall has these giant monolithic stones with these layered copestones, and it really gives a distinct appearance to the wall. Sometimes we see those monolithic stones in gateposts or other uses to divide walls in New England. But again, if I were approaching this from a preservation perspective, I'd definitely be noting these elements of construction. And in considering repair, you also need to think about the types of stone that the wall is constructed with. Sometimes it's difficult to find local stone that really fits your project. I know this was a question with the Aquidneck Stonewall project. How do we find stone to supplement what might be missing? And they were able to find some sort of loose agricultural stone from a stone pile in the field to just supplement those few stones that they just couldn't get to work. So it's definitely an important consideration. And finally, we have this question of mortar. As you know, traditional agricultural walls were dry laid. We see the introduction of mortar more in those estate walls or walls built in the 19th century. But people that are trying to repair dry laid stone walls will often ask, well, if we add mortar in certain locations, is there a benefit? If I add mortar under the capstone, maybe I could prevent theft. Or if I add mortar to the harding stones, maybe that will help to kind of hold the wall together for a longer period so I don't have to repair it as often. While these are done with good intentions, I've seen these interventions fail in various ways. With the capstone example, the rest of the stone wall kind of crumbled underneath and the capstones were just sort of held in place. With the harding example, kind of the same thing. The harding kind of stayed together and was too rigid, but the rest of the wall sort of started to belly out and crumble around it. So I would advise avoiding using mortar unless it was part of the wall's original construction. So to summarize, with your repair considerations, you'll need to consider the wall type. Like I was saying with the wild walls versus historical and estate walls, the important thing to think about, and this is a philosophical decision, is do I consider a wild wall a ruin, much like you'd consider an ancient ruin? Is interfering with the wall diminishing its authenticity? Often with historical and estate walls, that's a pretty straightforward repair decision, but those kind of wild walls, the ones that are a little less put together, becomes more of a philosophical question. You'll definitely want to look at wall construction, the type of stone, how it's constructed in terms of height and width. And also remember that gap repairs are possible. I included this phone from Casey Farm to show that repair isn't all or nothing. You can repair small sections of wall at a time. We repair where it's dipped down in the photo. We just repaired that section and had really great results. And the community really noticed that it made a big difference. So thinking of things in segments rather than complete rebuilds is really important too. So the important thing to remember is the not so glamorous task of regular maintenance, but it really are these grassroots efforts that keep stone walls intact. So kind of annually inspecting or monitoring walls. I do this in the easement program. I'm checking in to see if are any vines or ivy or other vegetation, resetting stones as soon as they fall off if you're able to, because sometimes that'll happen after a storm or maybe a tree has fallen on the wall. Removing leaves and debris consistently will help protect the wall during freeze and thaw cycles. Those leaves and debris hold in a lot of moisture and can cause damage in many cases. And of course, looking for volunteer opportunities. I think looking at the Aquidneck Stonewall Initiative is a great, if you look at their website, is a great model for local community work and training people in the art of stonewall building to kind of take on the task, because we need as many people as we can get. And so I'll close with this quote, because I think it reflects that idea of perpetuating the craft of stonewall building. So this is from Dan Snow, who's a dry stone artist. And he says, we need to do all we can to preserve walls, but it's not necessary that they remain in some state of amber exactly as they were 1,000 years ago or 100 years ago, or even yesterday. Preservation is part of a continuum of the craft, which includes restoration. There are good reasons to repair and rebuild historic works. And I think this is particularly true with dry stone walls. You have a lot of loose elements that need to be put back together, and continuing the craft and training new people in that art of putting things back together is part of preservation. There's a great decline in the number of people trained in traditional building trades, and it is certainly important in order to preserve walls in the future to keep training new people. So I'll leave you also with some resources. We have here, the top bullets are books. I'm sure you can ask your librarians at the Rockport Library to order you these books if you haven't already. They are fantastic. They informed this presentation greatly, would highly recommend them. I also included some links to the different initiatives that I mentioned. The Yukon Stonewall Initiative is another excellent website to check out. Another great effort being done there. And lastly, before questions, I would just like to invite everyone. I've been asked to plug the summit. It is a fantastic opportunity. If you are at all interested in preservation and allied fields, it's our second annual summit. It is in November in Providence, and it will be a fantastic meeting of the minds, everything from sustainability to housing, accessibility, anything to do with preservation and how it connects to the world at large. So if you're in the area, please stop by. We would love to have you. And then I will take questions. Thank you.
Thank you. That was absolutely wonderful. So yes, if anybody has any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat, or if you raise your hand, either in your camera or using the hand raise function, I'll unmute you and you can ask it directly. But thank you, Jennifer, for a wonderful presentation.
I know it's a lot to pack in the time, but I hope there was some useful information there for everyone out in the audience.
That's
And now I'm interested, because I've been to Rockport once. Now I want to go evaluate the Stonewalls. And if someone wants to tell me about the status of the local Stonewall ordinance too, it looked like it was part of a sort of planning. It was done in like early 2000s, but I'm not sure if anything ever came of it. It's an interesting, I've seen it, like the town of Sutton has like a ordinance that protects their scenic roads with stone walls. So it's kind of an interesting way to try to get the law on your side if possible.
Yeah, no, that is a good question. I'm not 100% sure. I know we have a scenic byway, but I'm not sure about the walls in that area.
Because I think the state control, from what I understand, the state roads can't be included in under local zoning. So it has to be like a locally designated road. So if it's a road that's like a state or interstate road, it doesn't allow you to fall under that Scenic Roads Act. But
interesting. Yeah, I actually I had a question. Was there a certain point where because there's where walls, like retaining walls, were started to become a thing? When
that's a really good question. I don't know if there's a specific time. It would have to be when enough stone was available, right, to start building them. But in terms of agriculture, you also see retaining walls used in like bank barns. Those are barns that are built into the sides of hills, basically, or, you know, where the topography shifts. So there are retaining walls and other types of walls that were being used from an agricultural perspective to like shape the land. So at least in the mid 18th century.
Thank you.
That road the example I showed, that it probably started as like a minor retaining wall. And then because the roadbed has gone up over time, but the farm hasn't, they ended up with even more like dirt on one side than the other. So it was even more of a challenge for that mason, which is why I said it was so important to have someone that knew what they were doing.
Yeah, I always figured there was a lot involved, much more involved into it than stacking a bunch of stones on top. But my goodness, there is a lot to it.
There is a lot to learn. It is an art form. Doing that workshop was just a game changer. So
yeah. What kind of backgrounds do these types of masons have?
So it's interesting. There's very few places that give like a true dry Stonewall certification, which is one of the things that the Stonewall Trust offers. They've started to try to, you can get certified to different levels. Like you can learn like double walls get certified, and then it gets more and more complicated. And so they've worked with this Dry Stone Walling Association in Great Britain, who I also think has levels of certification, to kind of develop this framework for people so that they know, okay, this person is trained in this skill and has completed these workshops. You know, but that's what makes it difficult to find people who you can trust to do the right work.
Goodness, wonderful.
It looks like there was a question from Catherine. Were there boundary disputes after a wall was built? If the wall was not built according to the survey? I think that this is true. I think one of the more interesting, I haven't done extensive primary source research in this area, but I'm sure there were boundary disputes, and also, like I was saying, disputes about the condition and quality of the wall. Towns would also specify how high your wall had to be if it was being used for agricultural use, and if it wasn't meeting those standards. So a lot of those disputes are between neighbors, which is, I always think of the Robert Frost, good fences make good neighbors, in this case stone walls, which were also called fences at the time. But I'm sure you can find evidence of that in different records. And that was the job of that fence viewer, which there are still fence viewers out there, I found. In some towns, there are still a town designated fence viewer. It's very, dates way, way back, but.
Fascinating.
I will say, maybe in closing, one of my favorite masonry terms I learned from the Stonewall workshop, and it's also the title of a book I recommended, is called The Granite Kiss. So the granite kiss is essentially, as you're adjusting those stones, they're so heavy, occasionally you drop one on your finger, and that is called the granite kiss. So it's a term that gets like, oh, I got the granite kiss. It's like usually when your finger just gets pinched like really hard, but I thought it was funny that was used for that book title, but that's a great book too.
It is excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming out or stopping in tonight. And thank you again, Jennifer, for a wonderful presentation. And for everybody, this is being recorded, and I will email out the link within the next few days. So
that's fantastic. And if anyone has any additional questions, I'm sure you can reach out to Cindy, but my email is jrobinson at historicnewengland.org. So pretty straightforward. If you thought of something and you just want to ask it later, that's fine too.
Great. I appreciate that, Jennifer.
Yep.
Thank you so much. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.